From the Moan Broadcast Center, it's Air Talk. Good afternoon. I'm Larry Mantle. The DA's office investigating the race car death of driver Kevin Ward Jr. by driver Tony Stewart is going to a grand jury in upstate New York. Stewart hit and killed Ward during a dirt track race on August 9th. Their cars had collided. Ward then got out of his vehicle and started yelling at Stewart while he was on the track. Stewart's car struck and killed Ward just after other race cars safely passed by. Joining us to talk about the case is Los Angeles Times writer who covers NASCAR, Jim Peltz. Jim, good to have you with us.
Nice to be here, Larry. Thank you.
I remember back in the days long ago, you used to do the Sports Wire on the phone, that old service. I actually called in to get your sports updates on it.
I see. Good.
It takes us back. So let me ask you about this case here. How long was it that Stewart was off the NASCAR circuit before he returned after this incident?
He sat out the next three races. That was about 3 weeks. Just for those of your listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the exact hierarchy of where he races, he of course, he's known primarily for racing in NASCAR's Sprint Cup Series, which is their top level. And he sat out the next three Sprint Cup Series races where he mainly competes. He said later, the only thing he has said, he returned on August 31st at Michigan, and he read a brief statement about 2 minutes long, in which he said, I basically sat out not only in consideration of the young man's family and friends, but also to sort of get himself together. He's been racing ever since. That's been about the last three races he's been, and he plans to race again this weekend in New Hampshire.
Okay. And so he hadn't commented specifically, but presumably he's spoken to investigators in New York. Is it likely that he'll be called before the grand jury to testify further?
Probably not. Most of the legal experts that I talked to yesterday in discussing the whole grand jury proceedings, it's very uncommon, they said, for prosecutors to ask for the potential defendants to testify in a case like that. I mean, not only does it sort of mess up their laying out the reasons why they want to bring an indictment, but also there's not a whole lot to be gained for the defendant in these situations. So the grand juries, as I understand it, can request that a defendant appear, but it's highly unusual.
We're talking with Jim Peltz, covers NASCAR for the Los Angeles Times. I'd like to hear from you. You've undoubtedly seen that very sad video in which the car driven by Tony Stewart strikes and kills Kevin Ward Jr., who's walked out onto the track angry and gesturing at Stewart after their cars had collided earlier in the race. We're at 866-893-KPCC, 866-893-5722, or the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. Also with us is Peter Mesich, an attorney who's based in San Diego. Mr. Mesich, welcome.
Hi, Larry. Thank you for having me.
So in a case like this, what are going to be the factors that the grand jury would be looking at to determine whether this is a criminal act?
Well, what's interesting about this case is that when it comes to the Kevin Ward actually being killed, there's three different standards that they can look for, three different types of charges. The first is premeditated, and in that case, what they'd be looking for is an intent to kill, and that just doesn't seem to be present in this case. The second one would be second degree, where basically what he was trying to do is he was trying to hurt him. And again, that's also unlikely because although Tony Stewart is known as a hothead, or sometimes his emotions get the best of him, there doesn't appear to be any intent that he actually wanted to hurt him. And last, of course, is negligence. And in that case, what they'd be looking for is a type of behavior that would deviate from the duty that Tony Stewart was expected to be under at the time. And as can be seen in the video, that there was an accident and the track was under a yellow flag. In that case, what they'd be looking for to determine if what Tony Stewart did deviated from the standard of conduct that should have been exhibited on a racetrack at the time.
So that would mean the speed that he was driving, ability to maneuver around an obstacle, those sorts of things would be legitimate considerations for manslaughter?
That's correct. And also, what can be identified from the video is that it appears the one that was released and was viral on the internet, is that it appears that there was a gunning of the engine and that Tony Stewart's car did kick out to the side. None of the other cars on the track did that. So what also the debate seems to be around is, was that done on purpose or was that done by accident?
All right. We're at 866-893-KPCC, the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. You're, of course, looking at a lower threshold for civil liability. And do you think, based on what you see on the tape, that Tony Stewart is vulnerable there to a significant judgment on the family's behalf?
Yeah, when it comes down to the civil case, of course, the standard that they'd be looking for in the court is lower, whereas criminal, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. With civil, it's preponderance of the evidence, or generally known as 50%. Although it took place on a racetrack, and most likely there's liability forms both for the teams and the track, someone cannot contract away their responsibility to act with due diligence. What they'd be looking for in this case is something similar to an extreme departure from ordinary standard of conduct. So again, that basically what Tony Stewart did was beyond the ordinary care of conduct for a race car driver on the track under a yellow flag.
All right, Emberlyn writes on the Air Talk page, anybody who knows anything about racing knows Kevin Ward should not have been on the track. You do not get out of your car on the track when cars are driving until the safety crew arrives at your car. I don't believe for 1 minute Tony Stewart was at fault at all for this accident. And I believe from the video you can see Tony was trying to avoid him. No driver would ever, ever, ever hit anybody on purpose. You can share your comments on the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. Frank in Azusa, welcome. Frank, go right ahead.
Oh, yes. My only comment is this, it seems like a kind of weird when you see the video and the other drivers, they really did try to avoid the kid, except him. And for a guy with experience like him, you know what, I don't know. I mean, I'd rather see this in a trial and let, experienced people to review the video 100 times. And I tell you, only God and this guy knows exactly what happened, right? But for the extreme like this guy, and not only that, I believe that the guy had already some kind of a speedway race experience before with some kind of other drivers, something like that.
Yeah, and I wonder, would that be relevant, Peter Mesich, that he's known as a hothead? Would that factor in, or is this of degrees of magnitude different to where that, would a judge allow that to be introduced if this goes to trial?
If it went to trial, it's a little bit of a different question. As the place that we're at right now for the grand jury, it is something that they can consider. Something that's important about grand jury proceedings is that they're completely secret. What that means is that the order of the witnesses that come in and what they consider is all secret. It's also important that there's no defense attorney present, so sometimes things that might not come into a jury trial can come into a grand jury proceeding. It's also important that the caller makes a point in that he believes that even though he was on the track, the skill of Tony Stewart still exceeds basically Kevin Ward's culpability in this case. And that's another reason why it's important to have this done by a grand jury, so it's not one person making this consideration, but actually 12 out of 16 in the state of New York.
And I guess we don't know whether Stewart saw Ward or not. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Jim Peltz, before we take a quick break, then we'll come back and continue. What's been the impact of this on the NASCAR circuit? What is this become and stayed the talk of it?
Well, it's obviously the talk of the sport. NASCAR, and of course this has nothing to do with NASCAR. It was not a NASCAR-sanctioned race. It was a race at a small dirt track, as you said, in upstate New York. Tony Stewart is 43 years old. He's been doing this for a long time, and he likes to moonlight when he's not driving NASCAR. He likes to moonlight and racing these small, fast sprint cars on dirt tracks, and that's why he was doing this. So the whole thing was sort of removed from NASCAR, and all the people in NASCAR, his fellow drivers, and the sport itself were as stunned as anyone else when this all happened.
We're talking with Jim Peltz, who covers the NASCAR circuit for the L.A. Times, Peter Mesich, an attorney based in San Diego, who's been writing about the potential prosecution of NASCAR driver Tony Stewart in the death of Kevin Ward Jr. on that dirt track race back on August 9th. The DA in upstate New York has sent it to the county grand jury, where they're going to consider whether an indictment will be handed down in the case or not. You've seen the video more than likely. What do you think based on what you've seen? Do you think that there is any criminality of the incident, or that the responsibility tragically falls fully on Ward in this case for getting out of his car and walking onto the track? 866-893-KPCC or the Air Talk page will continue after an update from Hetty Lynn Hurdes. Good afternoon, it's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Coming up, BBC NewsHour just about half an hour from now. A look at the Scottish referendum on the eve of that huge vote. Scots will go to the polls and decide whether they want to be independent from England. You'll hear all about that, and it'll be great because they'll really set the scene of what things are like in Edinburgh and Glasgow and other parts of Scotland. That's coming up in half an hour, right after Air Talk here on KPCC. We're talking about right now the case of race car driver Tony Stewart, the case involving his car striking and killing dirt track driver Kevin Ward Jr. just over a month ago. Grand jury in upstate New York is taking up evidence in the case. We're talking with the LA Times NASCAR writer Jim Peltz and Peter Mesich, an attorney based in San Diego, who's been writing about the legal aspects of the case. Wally in the city of Orange, welcome. You're on Air Talk.
Yeah, hi, Larry.
Hi.
I just wanted to, when you opened the segment, you had mentioned that everybody had passed him safely,
Yes.
Which indeed they passed him safely, but the car directly in front of Tony Stewart had said, right after it happened, he says, I saw him at the last second. I had to take evasive action. And then Tony was the next car in line. And if you've never driven one of those race cars, and I used to drive those cars, the leading edge of the wing is quite low, and the sideboards that are on the wing, and especially on the right side, are quite low, and you don't see out of them very well. And if you're in a corner, then you don't see, as you're turning the radius of the corner, if the track's banked at all, you can't see across the corner because of the wings in your way. So if you see them at the last second, you don't have a heck of a lot of time. If it's a yellow flag, you could be looking at your gauges, not paying much attention because you don't really expect folks to be walking around on the racetrack, especially coming down the racetrack. So
yeah,
it's not as cut and dry as it seems.
No, and I appreciate you having been a driver sharing that perspective. The other thing, I'd be curious your take on this. The video made the track look dark. Now, I don't know if that is a function of the equipment that was shooting the video, but Wally, from your experience or based on what you saw, do you think it likely the track could have been rather dark or not?
Well, it probably is. Most little dirt tracks around the country are fairly dark. I mean, we have a racetrack here called Irwindale, and it's like daylight inside. And if you ever raced at Ascot years ago, it was pretty dark. And it's just a function of, the cards you're dealt out there. You also have cover lenses on because the race cars are throwing dirt at you. And a good race car driver doesn't throw away his cover lenses till he basically can't see, because if you run out of them during the race, you're not in very good shape. So he could have a bunch of cover lenses on, or a cover lens that was fairly dirty, and the kid was wearing a black uniform. And those cars don't turn. They're not like normal cars. They've got 18 inches of stagger, meaning the right rear tire is 18 inches bigger than the left, and going slow. They don't really like to react, and you can't turn right if you're going to try to get out of the way because of that stagger. And sometimes the only way you can get the car to turn in a hurry is to roll the throttle a little bit to get it to scoot the nose over, because you steer in a dirt track car with the throttle more than with the steering wheel. So if people that have never driven those cars, even road race guys that are, expert road race pavement guys, don't understand the dirt as well as, like Parnell Jones, A.J. Foyt, those guys knew all about it. Nowadays, people are kind of specialized, and Tony Stewart's one of the few guys that goes back and forth.
Wally, this is really interesting, very informative. Thank you so much for calling in and making a big contribution to the program. Peter Mesich, for a grand jury, then, hearing testimony about this, is it likely that you would have the attorney for Stewart who would be raising these issues that Wally has brought up?
Unfortunately, no. If Tony Stewart is called before the grand jury, he has the right to have his attorney present, but his attorney can only help exercise his Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself. The defense attorney does not have an opportunity to call his own witnesses or to cross-examine any of the other witnesses that are present. Now, the grand jury is only looking for a strong suspicion that a crime occurred, but the procedures are governed by the district attorney himself. Now, you brought up a number of interesting issues, the caller did, and what the grand jury does have is it has subpoena power. So what they can do is they can subpoena some of the other drivers that were on the track to talk about the conditions, or they can call in other sprint car drivers to talk about the same determinations, what can be seen or not seen from the car to help them reach a conclusion, did negligence occur or not.
And then the lighting of the track would be one of the factors presumably in there as to whether Stewart could have reasonably been expected to see Ward.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Jim Peltz, your thought, anything you can add about the conditions at dirt tracks, lighting the cars, anything beyond what Wally just shared?
Well, the main thing I would just add to all of that is the fact that Tony Stewart's been doing this for 25 to 30 years. So if anyone was familiar with the conditions of a small dirt track in an obscure spot, dimly lit or whatever, it would be Tony Stewart, because he's done this a million times. This segment is a perfect example of why this story was so big, or is so big, because there are several layers involved, one of which is, as one of the callers pointed out, Tony's somewhat acerbic personality in his past run-ins with other drivers and the media and even NASCAR, and all of that sort of added to the narrative that's going on here about what his intent may or may not have been. But the other thing that makes this story so big is that video. And as we've just heard on this segment, anybody who has watched the video who doesn't know the first thing about racing can watch it and form an opinion about what happened. And that's exactly what's been going on. And it's really fascinating to watch.
It is as a social phenomenon. I think you're absolutely right. And you the horror of it, the tragedy of it, the emotional response that we all have and react out of that frame of mind too. Jim, do you think that anything comes out of this in how tracks are handled or how drivers look at what they're doing? Have you heard any conversation about any institutional changes out of this?
Well, it's already happened, Larry. A week after this happened, NASCAR announced that it put many more restrictions on when drivers can get out of their cars. One of the things I think that's important to note is Kevin Ward Jr. was basically mimicking what he has seen the big boys do in NASCAR and other motorsports, where sometimes after they've collided with someone or they're mad at someone, they'll get out of the car and they'll stand there and they'll point to the rival that they're angry at as they come back around. But keep in mind, usually they're doing it on big, wide super speedways. They're usually standing next to some rescue worker. They're safely out of harm's way. Kevin Ward unfortunately wasn't in that situation. He was on a very small place and basically tried to mimic what they're doing. So NASCAR decided a week later, you know what, we're going to try and stop this whole business of drivers getting out of their cars and pointing at each other or throwing helmets at each other. And so now they can only get out of the car basically if it's on fire. Otherwise, they're supposed to stay put.
Jim, thank you very much. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise in covering this beat for the LA Times. Good to talk with you. Jim Peltz covers NASCAR for the Times. Peter Mesich, attorney based in San Diego. Thank you very much. Appreciate you offering your legal expertise. I know you've been fascinated by this and writing about it. And thank you for talking with us about it today.
Great. Thank you for having me, Larry.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And Julie in Burbank says, I don't imagine drivers are prepared to stop when other drivers walk onto the track. The lighting of the track looked dark. It just seems to me like this was a tragic accident. Share your comments on the Air Talk page, kpcc.org.